Naomi curled up in the corner of her room, clutching her worn-out teddy bear. The dim light from the hallway cast eerie shadows across her face as the door creaked open. Her mother's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "If you say a word, I will make sure you regret it." Naomi held her breath. If she told the truth, everything would change forever. But could she find the courage to do it? What would you do if you were in Naomi's shoes? Would you have the strength to speak up, or would fear keep you silent? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is the story of a little girl trapped between fear and justice, between the past and a future she barely dares to hope for. Will the truth finally come to light? Stay with us to find out. The streets of Greenfield lay silent under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The houses along the road were quiet, their windows dark, except for one. At the very end of the block, a single house stood in eerie stillness. Inside, behind a locked bedroom door, a little girl sat huddled in the corner, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to her chest. She barely dared to breathe. Naomi Greenfield, just 10 years old, had learned long ago how to listen without making a sound. From the other room, her mother's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "If she opens her mouth in court tomorrow, I lose everything. I won't let that happen." Her mother's tone was sharp, cold, controlled, yet laced with something more dangerous. A warning, a threat. A chill crept up Naomi's spine as her grip tightened around her teddy bear, the only thing left that still smelled like home, like her father. She knew what her mother meant. She meant Naomi had one job tomorrow. Stay silent. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, the air in her room suddenly thick, suffocating. She had always done as she was told. She had buried the truth deep inside, just like her mother wanted. But now that truth was clawing its way to the surface. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of a judge. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice. Would she keep the secret like she always had, or would she finally speak the truth? Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, a man sat at his kitchen table, shoulders slumped, fingers tracing the edges of an old photograph. Benjamin Carter, Naomi's father, had lived in silence for 3 long years. 3 years since he had last held her. 3 years since the court had ruled him unfit. 3 years since he had lost her. His thumb brushed over the smiling face in the photograph. Naomi, barely 7 years old, perched on his shoulders, her tiny hands clutching his head as she giggled. A moment frozen in time, untouched by the pain that followed. But reality was far less kind. Beside the photograph lay a folded letter, creased from being opened too many times. His fingers trembled as he picked it up once more, his heart sinking as he read the familiar words. "Daddy, I miss you. Why didn't you come get me?" A deep, aching breath escaped his lips. He had tried. God, he had tried. But the system had failed him. The court had seen a single arrest, a wrongful accusation, and labeled him a risk. And Meredith, she had made sure Naomi believed that he never wanted her. Benjamin clenched the letter in his fist, his jaw tightening. His world had been frozen in place ever since they had taken Naomi away. But tomorrow, that could change. With a deep, steadying breath, he whispered into the dimly lit room. "I'm coming for you, baby girl, I promise." But was it too late? Would Naomi find the courage to speak the truth? And even if she did, would anyone believe her? The courtroom was nothing like a home, cold, indifferent. A place where decisions were made by people who didn't know, didn't care, and wouldn't feel the weight of what they were about to do. Benjamin Carter sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched into fists beneath the polished wood. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the droning voice of the judge. None of it mattered. Nothing except the sound of her voice. "Daddy!" A child's scream shattered the stiff silence. Across the room, Naomi struggled against the arms of a social worker, her tiny hands reaching, fingers stretching, desperate to hold on. "I don't want to leave. I want to go home with you." Her voice cracked. Tears streamed down her round cheeks. She fought as hard as she could, but it didn't matter. She was too small, too powerless. Benjamin lurched forward, instinct kicking in. "Please, Your Honor, listen to her. She's just a child." "Mr. Carter, sit down." The judge's voice was firm, unmoved. But how could he sit down? How could he just watch them take his daughter away? His breath was shallow, his chest burning as he turned back to Naomi. "I love you, baby. You hear me? Daddy loves you. A heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder, a court officer, ready to force him into submission if he resisted. Across the room, Meredith Carter sat poised, composed, her expression a mask of concern. But behind that mask was something else. Something cold, calculated. She let out a delicate sigh, shaking her head as if she were exhausted by it all. Your Honor, we cannot allow emotions to cloud judgment. Benjamin clenched his jaw. Emotions? This wasn't about emotions. This was about truth, about justice, about Naomi. But Meredith's voice was smooth, rehearsed, every word a calculated strike. My only priority is my daughter's safety. And I have reason to believe that being in his custody is dangerous for her. Lies. Every word was a lie. Benjamin turned, fury rising in his chest. I would never hurt my daughter. His voice cracked, not in rage but in desperation. I wish I could believe that. Meredith lowered her gaze, playing her part perfectly. Then she turned to the jury, her eyes full of false sorrow. But let's not forget, this isn't the first time Benjamin Carter has had a run-in with the law. And just like that, the room shifted. Benjamin felt it immediately, the moment everything turned against him. The judge's expression hardened. The jury exchanged wary glances. The prosecutor leaned forward, flipping through a file. Benjamin felt the weight of his past pressing down on him like a noose tightening around his throat. Yes, he had been arrested once, wrongfully. But to the court, that didn't matter. A black man, handcuffed, a stain on his record, no matter how innocent. His lawyer stood, voice strong but not strong enough. Nothing would be strong enough against the bias already seeping into the room. Your Honor, that arrest was a mistake. My client was never convicted of any crime. He has a stable job, a clean record since then. Meredith let out a soft, bitter laugh. A stable job? He's a mechanic. He works long hours. Tell me, Judge, is that really a suitable environment for a child? Would Naomi be fed properly? Would she have the stability she needs? Benjamin's stomach twisted. He knew what she was doing. She wasn't just attacking his past, she was attacking his worth. The judge folded her hands, considering. Judging. Mr. Carter, she finally spoke, voice heavy with finality. While we acknowledge that you love your daughter, we must prioritize what is in the best interest of the child. Given the circumstances and the concerns presented today, the court rules in favor of the mother. Full custody is awarded to Meredith Carter. The words hit like a hammer to his chest. No, Naomi screamed. No! Please, no! Daddy! Her sobs shattered through the courtroom. She kicked, twisted in the arms holding her back, her tiny body fighting with everything she had left. Benjamin took a step forward, but the officer's grip on his arm tightened, pinning him in place. Let her go. His voice was raw, breaking under the weight of his grief, but it was too late. The gavel struck. Decision made. A lifetime of moments stolen in an instant. Naomi thrashed, her face streaked with tears. Her small hand shot up one last time, fingers reaching, begging. Daddy, don't let them take me. Benjamin lunged forward, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of his own helplessness. He watched helplessly, painfully, as the door swung shut, and just like that, she was gone. Benjamin Carter sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the stack of unopened letters spread before him. His fingers brushed over the edges of each envelope, the ink slightly smudged from where his hands had lingered too long. He had written them all, letters meant for his daughter, letters she would never read. There were over 100 now, maybe more. Each one sealed with the same quiet plea, the same desperate hope. Naomi, sweetheart, I love you. I miss you. Are you okay? Please write back. Please. But please had never been enough. Not once had he received a reply. Benjamin swallowed hard, rubbing his thumb over the corner of an envelope, creased and worn from years of waiting. Did she even know? Did she know how many nights he had sat right here, writing her name over and over, only to have his words lost in silence? At first, he told himself that Meredith was keeping the letters from her, that she was throwing them away before Naomi ever had a chance to see them. But as the months turned into years, another thought crept in, one that was far worse. What if Naomi wasn't waiting? What if she wasn't looking for him? What if she had already let him go? The thought burned more than any court ruling, more than any door slammed in his face. Benjamin closed his eyes, his breath unsteady. He couldn't believe that. He refused to. Because if she had forgotten him, then what had he been fighting for all this time? For 3 years, Benjamin had found himself standing in the same place, beyond the black iron gate, looking in. Meredith's house sat at the end of Ridgeway Lane, pristine, perfect, lifeless. To anyone else, it was a home, a safe haven, but to Benjamin, it was a prison. Because inside that house, somewhere behind those windows, was Naomi. And no matter how many times he came, no matter how many hours he stood outside waiting for just one glimpse of her, the result was always the same. The front door would open, and she would be standing there. Meredith Carter, calm, collected, poised like a queen addressing a beggar. She never yelled, never raised her voice. No, she was too smart for that. Instead, she would tilt her head, a slow, knowing smile stretching across her lips. "Still holding on, Ben?" she would murmur, feigning sympathy. 3 years. Shouldn't you move on? The first time, he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The second time, he tried to reason with her. The third, the fourth, the fifth, he had stopped speaking altogether. Because it didn't matter. Nothing he said would change the fact that she held all the power. She would stand there, waiting, letting the silence stretch. And then, just before turning away, she would give him the final blow. "She doesn't ask about you, you know." And with that, the door would close, locking him out. Again. Benjamin leaned against the cold metal of the gate, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. 3 years. 3 years of letters unread. 3 years of standing at this doorstep, waiting for nothing. A gust of wind swept past, biting against his skin. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath disappear into the night. Maybe Meredith was right. Maybe Naomi really had moved on. But deep down, deep in the part of his soul that still belonged to his little girl, he refused to believe it. Because if she had forgotten him, then what had he been fighting for all this time? Naomi Carter sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the rain-speckled window. The world outside felt distant, unreachable, like something from a dream she had long forgotten. She traced a finger along the fogged-up glass, drawing nothing in particular, just lines, circles, anything to keep her hands busy, anything to keep her mind from asking the question she had learned not to ask. "Where's Daddy?" But the question still lived inside her, tucked away into the corners of her heart. It pressed against her ribs every night when she lay awake, wondering why he never came for her. The first few months after the court ruling, Naomi had waited by the window, convinced that at any moment her father would appear. He had promised. "I'll see you soon, sweetheart." But soon had stretched into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. And now, sitting in the same house that had swallowed up her childhood, Naomi wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Had he forgotten her? Had he ever really wanted her at all? She squeezed her eyes shut. That couldn't be true. Daddy loved her. She knew he did. Didn't he? "Naomi." Her mother's voice snapped through the air, sharp and unforgiving. Naomi flinched, turning to see Meredith standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. "What are you doing?" Naomi swallowed. She knew better than to lie. "Nothing," she murmured. Meredith's eyes narrowed. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "You were thinking about him again, weren't you?" Naomi didn't answer. Didn't have to. Meredith let out a cold, humorless laugh. She crossed the room, reaching for Naomi's chin, tilting her face upward. "Listen to me," she said, her grip firm, nails pressing just slightly into Naomi's skin. "That man never wanted you. Do you understand?" Naomi's stomach twisted. "But he left you, Naomi." Meredith's voice was slow, deliberate, as if speaking to a child too stupid to understand. "He didn't fight for you. He didn't love you enough to stay." "That's not true," Naomi blurted out before she could stop herself. A mistake. A fatal one. Because the moment the words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Meredith's expression darkened. Her grip on Naomi's chin tightened just slightly, just enough to remind her who had the power here. Then, just as quickly, she released her, straightening her blouse, exhaling through her nose, as if trying to contain her disappointment. She turned away, walking toward the vanity, and for a fleeting second, Naomi thought the conversation was over. She was wrong. Without warning, Meredith's hand swiped across the surface, knocking over everything in her path. The perfume bottle shattered against the floor. A jewelry box crashed into the dresser. A framed picture tipped over, glass splintering into tiny shards. Naomi flinched at the sudden explosion of sound. her body stiffening. Meredith never hit her. She didn't have to. The house itself bent to her anger. A cold silence followed. Then, in a voice eerily calm, Meredith spoke again. "I don't want to hear his name in this house again. Do you understand me?" Naomi nodded quickly, her throat too tight to form words. Meredith stepped closer, crouching to Naomi's level, her fingers brushing a stray curl from the girl's face. "Good girl." And with that, she stood, turned, and walked out, leaving behind the wreckage. Leaving behind Naomi, breathing fast, trying not to cry. She sat there for a long time, staring at the broken perfume bottle, watching the liquid seep into the floorboards. Her hands curled into fists on her lap. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something, break something, fight back. But she didn't. Because deep down, in the space where hope had once lived, doubt had begun to take root. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe Daddy never really fought for her. Maybe he had let her go. And maybe, just maybe, she needed to let go of him too. Naomi sat curled up in her bed, knees hugged tightly to her chest. The dim glow of her bedside lamp barely reached the far corners of the room, casting long shadows that flickered with every breath of wind against the curtains. Sleep never came easy in this house. But tonight, something felt different. The air was tense, thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then, voices. Muffled, hushed, but urgent. Slowly, Naomi swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. She moved like a ghost, inching toward her bedroom door. It wasn't fully closed, just barely ajar, just enough to hear. "I don't care what she wants," Meredith's voice sharp and low. "She's not going to that courtroom tomorrow." A pause, then another voice, deeper, smoother, the lawyer. "Meredith, if she doesn't testify, the judge may question." "I said no," Meredith snapped. "She's a child. She doesn't know what's best for her." "I do." Another pause, a slow, measured exhale. "And if she talks?" Meredith's next words were colder than Naomi had ever heard them. "She won't." A sharp, sickening chill crawled down Naomi's spine. Something inside her, a feeling she had buried long ago, came alive. A spark, a whisper of doubt, growing louder. She knew her mother had lied before. She knew something had never felt right. But this was different. This wasn't just about keeping her from her father. This was about silencing her. Forever. Naomi scrambled back to her bed, heart pounding. She needed to think. Fast. Tomorrow was the trial, the last chance. If she didn't make it to that courtroom, her stomach twisted. She couldn't let that happen. But as she reached for the lamp, ready to turn it off and feign sleep, she heard footsteps. Fast, sharp, coming toward her room. Panic surged through her veins. She jumped back into bed, just as the door swung open. Meredith stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. "Go to sleep." Her voice was flat, emotionless, final. Naomi didn't move, didn't breathe. Meredith stepped inside, and then click, the sound of a key turning, the lock sliding into place. "You're staying right here until this is over." Then, without another word, her mother was gone. The weight of the silence pressed against Naomi's chest. Her mother had never locked her in before. Not like this. A lump formed in her throat. She walked to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. Nothing. Her hands curled into fists. If she didn't get out now, she never would. Her eyes darted toward the window. The night was dark, the world outside stretching vast and endless beyond the glass pane. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the latch. Unlocked. Her pulse quickened. She had seen it in movies. Kids tying sheets together, climbing out like it was easy. But now, standing on the edge of her bed, looking down into the yard below, reality was much different. The ground felt too far, the drop too high, but there was no other way. She swallowed, tying the sheets together as tightly as her shaking hands allowed. Knots, double knots, triple knots. Then, gripping the fabric with every ounce of strength she had left, Naomi climbed. The night air was cold against her skin, the wind tugging at her hair as she lowered herself inch by inch. Her arms burned, her fingers ached, and then, the fabric ripped. She fell. A second of weightlessness, a sharp impact, the shock of pain as she hit the damp grass below. But she was alive. For the first time in years, Naomi was free. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting in her hands and knees. She had to run. She had to find him. She had to... Naomi? Her blood turned to ice. She whipped around. Her mother stood on the porch. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Meredith moved. Naomi ran, faster than she ever had before. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. The damp grass slipped beneath her bare feet, the cold biting against her skin as she sprinted into the night. Behind her, footsteps. Her mother was chasing her. "Naomi, stop!" Meredith's voice wasn't calm anymore. It wasn't composed. It was furious, desperate. Naomi didn't stop. She didn't look back. She tore through the yard, past the rose bushes, past the mailbox, past the world she had known for too long. She had to make it to the road. But then, a hand grabbed her wrist. Cold, tight, unyielding. Naomi gasped, twisting, fighting. "Let me go," she screamed. Meredith's grip tightened. Her nails dug into Naomi's skin. "You're not going anywhere." But she was. Naomi kicked. Hard. Her mother yelped, her grip loosening just enough. Naomi wrenched herself free and bolted into the street. Headlights. A car skidded to a stop. For a split second, Naomi thought she was going to be hit, but then a door swung open, and a voice. "Naomi?" A voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. A voice she never stopped waiting for. Her breath caught. Her feet froze in place. Her father, Benjamin. And then, she was running again, straight into his arms. The courthouse loomed above them, its towering columns stretching into the morning sky, as if swallowing every ounce of hope that dared to enter. Inside, the hallways were cold, lined with polished floors that reflected the dim glow of overhead lights. The scent of old paper, ink, and something else, something heavy like the residue of broken promises, lingered in the air. And in the middle of it all, Benjamin Carter stood frozen. His heart slammed against his ribs, because there, just down the hall, was Naomi. She stood motionless, small and fragile beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. She had grown. 3 years had passed, but she was still so small, too small for the weight she had been forced to carry. Her dark curls framed her face, but what struck him most were her eyes. Wide, searching, full of something he couldn't quite name. Was it fear? Hesitation? Or something deeper, something fragile and breakable? His breath caught. He wanted to run to her. God, he wanted to. But he didn't, he couldn't. Because what if she didn't want him anymore? What if she had believed every lie? What if she looked at him now and saw nothing but a stranger? The hallways stretched between them like an impossible distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Naomi's fingers twitched at her sides. Her eyes flickered downward, then back up. And then, slowly, hesitantly, she took a step forward. Then another, and then suddenly, she was running. Benjamin barely had time to react before her small arms flung around his waist, clutching the fabric of his jacket, holding on as if afraid he might disappear again. His breath hitched, his arms wrapped around her in an instant, his hands cradling the back of her head. "Baby girl," he whispered, voice breaking. "Oh God, Naomi." She was crying. He could feel her shaking against him. "I thought you left me," she choked out, her voice muffled against his chest. "I thought you didn't want me." His arms tightened around her, as if he could hold back every second they had lost. "Never," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I never stopped looking for you." Naomi clung to him, her sobs quiet but raw, the kind of cries that came from years of silence. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. For the first time in 3 years, Benjamin felt whole. But the moment was too brief, because just as quickly as Naomi had run into his arms, she was ripped away. A forceful yank, a gasp, and suddenly, Naomi was no longer in his arms. "Get away from her!" Meredith's voice sliced through the air like a blade. She stood there, her nails digging into Naomi's wrist, eyes wild with something between fury and panic. Benjamin's body went rigid. "Let her go, Meredith." His voice was low, controlled, but underneath, there was fire. Naomi winced, trying to pull away, but Meredith's grip tightened. "She is my daughter," Meredith hissed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You don't get to touch her." Benjamin took a step forward. "She is my daughter too." For the first time, Meredith's composure cracked. A flicker of something desperate, flashed across her face. Naomi felt it. She had spent her whole life reading her mother's moods, understanding the danger that came with every shift in her expression. And now for the first time, her mother looked afraid. Not of losing custody, not of the courtroom, but of losing control. Because Naomi had chosen, she had run to him. And Meredith knew that was something she could never take back. "Let me go." Naomi's voice trembled, but this time it was strong. Meredith's grip faltered, her fingers twitching for just a moment, and Naomi ripped herself free. Breathless, shaking, but free. For the second time in one night, she had escaped her mother's grasp. The heavy doors to the courtroom creaked open, a bailiff stepping into the hallway. "The hearing will begin shortly." Benjamin exhaled, his hands still hovering near Naomi as if afraid she might vanish again. She turned to him, wiping at her tears, her lips trembling, but this time not with fear. "Are you ready, baby girl?" Benjamin asked softly. Naomi lifted her chin. She wasn't ready, she was terrified, but she had made it this far. She had fought to be here, and now she had to finish it. So she nodded, and hand in hand, father and daughter stepped into the courtroom. Naomi sat on the wooden witness stand, her small hands gripping the edges so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than ever, as if it were pressing down on her, forcing her to shrink, to stay silent. Across from her, Meredith sat at the defendant's table. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. But her eyes were sharp, drilling into Naomi like knives, a warning, a silent threat. Naomi swallowed hard, her legs dangled above the floor. She felt small, weak, scared. She could still hear her mother's voice in her head. "You think he cares about you? He just wants to hurt me. If you say anything, I'll make sure you never see him again." Her chest tightened. What if she was making a mistake? What if this only made things worse? What if... Her gaze drifted across the room, and then she saw him. Benjamin. Her father sat just a few feet away, his hands clasped together, his posture tense. But his eyes were steady, strong, full of something that cut through every ounce of fear inside her. Love. A silent promise. "I'm here. You're not alone." And suddenly, Naomi wasn't afraid anymore. She lifted her chin, she turned back to the judge, and she spoke. "My mom lied." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Meredith stiffened. "She told me my dad didn't want me, that he left me. But he didn't. He was looking for me this whole time." She inhaled, her breath shaky but determined. "And that's not all." Naomi's hands shook slightly as she reached up, fingers brushing against the soft fabric resting atop her head. For a brief moment she hesitated. The bruises beneath her scalp were tender. She could still feel the sting from the last time. But that pain, it was nothing compared to the pain of staying silent. So she pulled, and the wig came off. Gasps filled the courtroom. Her natural curls tumbled free, but no one was looking at them. They were looking at the marks, faded yellow, angry purple, deep bruises staining her scalp, the kind that couldn't be hidden anymore. Someone in the jury covered their mouth. The judge's brow furrowed, his grip tightening around the gavel. And for the first time since the trial began, Meredith's mask cracked, her face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then closed again, as if searching for a way to explain the inexplicable. She's lying." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was no conviction in it, no power. Naomi clenched the wig in her lap, her small fingers digging into the fabric. She met her mother's gaze, eyes no longer filled with fear, but with truth. "No, I'm not." Her voice was stronger now, louder. "You did this to me." Meredith flinched, her hands curled into fists. She looked ready to lunge forward, ready to scream, ready to do something. "Your Honor," a new voice cut through the tension. All eyes turned toward the back of the room. And there, standing with a flash drive in hand, was Mrs. Eliza. Mrs. Eliza, Naomi's elderly neighbor, stepped forward, her presence commanding the room in a way no one expected. "I have proof," she announced, her voice steady. "Proof that Meredith Carter abused her daughter." Meredith's eyes widened. "That's ridiculous," she spat. "You can't just—" "Silence, Miss Carter," the judge ordered, his tone firm. Mrs. Eliza handed the flash drive to the court assistant, who quickly inserted it into the monitor. The screen flickered to life. And then the courtroom watched. The first clip was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Naomi curled in a corner, arms covering her head, while Meredith towered over her, a wine glass clutched in one hand. The glass shattered against the wall just inches from Naomi's face. The second clip, Meredith grabbing Naomi's wrist so hard that the little girl whimpered. The third, Meredith screaming, slamming a door so hard the entire frame rattled. And the last one, Naomi sitting alone on the porch in the cold, her knees drawn to her chest, crying, silent, forgotten. The courtroom was dead silent. The jury's faces were pale. The prosecutor folded her hands on the desk, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet victory in her eyes. Benjamin exhaled shakily, his hand clenched into a fist. And Meredith looked at Naomi. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were full of something Naomi had never seen before. Defeat. She had lost, and Naomi had won. Naomi sat stiffly on the witness stand, her small hands curled into fists in her lap. The truth was out. The bruises, the video, the years of neglect and cruelty exposed for everyone to see. Yet across the room, Meredith Carter sat as if nothing had changed. Her back was straight, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes, cold, dark, unyielding, were locked onto Naomi. A silent command, a last desperate attempt to intimidate. For a long moment, Naomi just stared back. She had spent her entire life trying to earn this woman's love, trying to be good enough, trying to be quiet enough, trying to make her mother happy. But standing there, seeing the emptiness in Meredith's eyes, Naomi understood something for the first time. She never could, she never would. A lump rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. The little girl who once craved her mother's approval was gone, and in her place, a fighter had been born. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, not from fear, but from clarity. She inhaled, her breath shaky but certain, and then in the softest yet most devastating voice imaginable, she spoke. "You never loved me." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Meredith flinched, her composure cracking for the first time. "You never loved me," Naomi repeated, her voice breaking but her spirit unshaken. "You only ever loved yourself." The silence was deafening, and then Meredith snapped. "You ungrateful little brat!" Meredith's chair scraped violently against the floor as she shot to her feet, her hands slamming against the table. The courtroom lurched. Officers tensed. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. Benjamin immediately stepped forward as if ready to shield Naomi from the storm. But Naomi didn't even flinch. For the first time, her mother's fury did not scare her. Meredith's face twisted with rage, her nails digging into the wood of the table. "You think he loves you?" she spat, jabbing a finger toward Benjamin. "You think he's better than me? He left you. He let them take you." "That's enough, Miss Carter," the judge's voice boomed, the gavel striking hard against the desk. But Meredith didn't stop. She couldn't. Her voice climbed higher, her breath ragged. "You don't know anything, you stupid little girl. Everything I did for you." Naomi's fingers tightened around the armrest of the witness stand. She could feel the room watching, waiting, and she knew this was it. This was the moment. She turned, staring directly into her mother's wild, furious eyes, and with all the strength she had left, she whispered, "No, Mom. Everything you did for yourself." A scream tore from Meredith's throat. "You little liar." She lunged forward, but the guards were faster. Two officers seized her arms, yanking her backward before she could take another step. "No," she shrieked, thrashing violently in their grip. "You can't do this. I am her mother. I gave her life. She belongs to me." But no one listened. The prosecutor remained stone-faced. The judge watched in silence. The jury looked away. Because Meredith Carter had already lost. Naomi exhaled slowly, watching as her mother was dragged away. She expected to feel something, guilt, sadness, but there was nothing. Just relief. "This isn't over." Meredith's shrieks echoed down the hallway as she disappeared beyond the doors. "Do you hear me, Naomi? This isn't over." But it was. For the first time in her life, it really, truly was. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke, until Benjamin did. He stepped forward, his every movement cautious, as if afraid she might shatter. But Naomi wasn't breaking. She was breathing. Benjamin knelt down, his voice gentle, careful. "Baby girl?" Naomi turned to him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "She's gone," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a realization, a truth that finally felt real. Benjamin nodded. "She can't hurt you anymore." And that's when it hit her. That's when everything crashed down. And Naomi sobbed. Deep, uncontrollable sobs racked through her small frame. Years of pain, fear, and loneliness pouring out all at once. Benjamin pulled her into his arms, holding her as she broke. As she let go. As she finally, for the first time in her life, felt safe. Naomi sat next to her father, her small hand gripping his tightly beneath the polished wooden table. Benjamin hadn't let go of her since Meredith had been dragged away, and he never would. The judge leaned forward, scanning the room with an expression neither cold nor warm, just resolute. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the welfare of the child in question, this court finds that Meredith Carter is unfit to retain custody. A hush fell over the courtroom. The final moment had arrived. Effective immediately, full legal and physical custody of Naomi Carter is awarded to her father, Benjamin Carter. Benjamin's breath hitched, his shoulders trembled, and for the first time in years, he wept. His head dropped forward, his body shaking with quiet, disbelieving sobs. Naomi didn't hesitate. She threw herself into his arms, wrapping her small arms around him as tightly as she could. "We did it, Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're going home." Benjamin clutched her, pressing his lips to the top of her head. "Yes, baby girl." Tears streamed down his face. "We're going home." The summer breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, warm pavement, and the faintest hint of vanilla from the candle burning inside the house. Naomi sat on the porch, her notebook open, her pen hovering above the page. For the first time in a long time, she was writing. Not a plea for help. Not a secret letter she'd never send. This was different. This was for them, for the kids like her. The ones still trapped, the ones still afraid. Her fingers tightened around the pen, and then she wrote. To every kid who feels alone, who feels unheard, who feels like no one will believe them, don't be silent. Don't let fear keep you in the dark, because justice is real, and it will find you if you dare to stand up. She let out a slow breath, pressing her palm against the page, feeling the weight of her words. Naomi didn't just survive her story, she had rewritten it. "You ready, baby girl?" Naomi looked up to see Benjamin standing by the porch steps, his hand outstretched. She nodded, slipping her hand into his as he led her to the front yard. The grass was cool beneath their feet as they lay down side by side, staring up at the endless expanse of stars. For so long, Naomi had looked at the night sky and felt small. Now she just felt free. "See that one?" Benjamin pointed to a bright star. "That's ours, the one that means hope." Naomi smiled, squeezing his hand. "I like that one." A comfortable silence settled between them, and for the first time in forever, Naomi knew there was no more fear waiting in the shadows. No more locked doors, no more whispered threats. Just this. Her father's warmth beside her. The stars above them, and a future that finally belonged to her. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the power of truth and justice, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means everything. It helps us continue creating meaningful stories that inspire, empower, and bring light to the darkest corners. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can make a difference.